Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about origins, and we have been going through recently different theories of creation. And today is the third section that we are going to talk about the different theories of creation. Okay, the theory we're going to talk about first is called the framework hypothesis. And it is primarily based upon the belief that since Genesis 1 is written as a poem, following a literary pattern, that it is not actually supposed to be a factual account, that it's simply a literary creation, almost an analogy or just kind of a poem to describe and to just make up the idea of the creation, that it wasn't supposed to be a literal claim. And you can see from the chart the idea being that this was not done in a particular order, but that it was done to try to kind of create a visual picture. That on day 1 you had the light, so day 4 you had the different planets and stars and things like that fit the light. Day 2 you had the division of the sea and the air, so on day 5 you had the creation of the things that lived in the sea and the air. Day 3 the same idea with lands and plants, and then the things that lived on the land. And that you just kind of have this parallel poem that does not necessarily describe any literal process. It is just supposed to be a cute story talking about how God created the world. That is the framework hypothesis, that it's just a story, a poem, that it's not an actual event. Okay, the next theory that we're going to talk about is called the gap theory. If you look at Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And Genesis 1:2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." The gap theory basically states that in Genesis 1:1 you have the creation being made, but then you have this passage of time of literally millions or billions of years, and then what you see in Genesis 1:2 is kind of another creation, that it's not a description of what happened in verse 1, but that it is another entirely different event. Okay, so verse 1 would not be seen as a summary of what was going to follow in the chapter, but that it was a single event, then time passed, and then in Genesis 1:2 you have a completely different event. Okay, so the gap theory believes in more than one creation, and talking about the difference between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 is primarily where they come up with the idea for the gap theory. Okay, I would like to show you this. The title page is a little weird, but I thought I would let a person that believes in the gap theory explain what the gap theory is. So here goes.
You mentioned the gap theory. We actually had a question specifically about that. So can you give a really brief synopsis of what the gap theory is?
Well, very briefly, the gap theory has usually held that between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, there's a gap. In Genesis 1:1 it says, "And the earth was, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And then in verse 2 it says, and the earth was, or the earth became, tohu wabohu, which means formless and void or something of the sort like that. And the gap theory, and there's some variations on it, but basically they hold that verse 2 denotes a state of chaos that was not original to creation. Tohu and bohu are words that are almost always pejorative. They denote a negative state of affairs. And the only other 2 times they're used together in the Bible, tohu wabohu, it denotes a state of judgment. And so the gap theory holds that God created the world, it was all good, wonderful, but then even before human beings came around, there was some kind of conflict that went on, perhaps in the heavenlies. Something went wrong, and the earth was judged, and that was the state of tohu wabohu. So what you get from verse 2 on in Genesis 1 is not the original creation of the earth. And by the way, the word earth, eretz in Hebrew, doesn't denote a planet. They didn't know about a planet. It just denotes the land. And that's important for other considerations that we can't go into right now. But so what you have is a restoration of the land and God reformulating the creation. Only other point I'd make is this. Genesis 1 isn't the only creation account in the Bible. In God at War, I outlined 13 other passages that the majority of scholars believe have to do with creation. And all of them involve conflict, what's called the chaos motif of the Old Testament, where God battles the waters or the cosmic monsters to create. And what hardly anyone is wondering about is how do we reconcile those conflict creation accounts with the Genesis account? Well, one plausible way is to take them all and they're right up there between verse 1 and verse 2. So,
Greg's far too humble to ever say this, but probably God at War in his chapter on this is the currently most plausible, sophisticated articulation of the gap theory available today. And I'm not one to easily compliment Greg.
Yeah, that's
This
true.
is
That's
saying
true.
a
Well,
lot.
thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. The thing is I don't believe half of that myself anymore. I've modified it, so just know that.
Okay, so you can see that there are different theories related to how creation could come into being. Sorry for the strange slide here. Okay, but you can at least tell that even though all of these people claim to be creationists, there are differences in what is believed as far as what the truth is, even though all of them are claiming to believe the Bible. Next time we will talk about some more traditional